For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Shannon de Rey-Hove. I'm with Nick Altini and Chris Charter of Cliff Decker Hofmeyr business law firm to discuss the Consumer Protection Act. You mentioned that juristic persons or small businesses with annual turnover values below 3 million rand qualify as consumers for CPA purposes, yet you believe that this seems unduly high. Why do you say this?
It seems a little bit high. The idea behind the Consumer Protection Act, and it's stated in its objectives, is to protect the most vulnerable elements of society, the illiterate, the commercially unsophisticated, those that live in rural areas. Now we accept, and of course the Act does apply to all consumers, even those who are not ordinarily vulnerable. And they've seen fit to extend that to juristic persons, companies, close corporations, and in this case partnerships. We just think that an organization that is earning income of about 3 million rand a year is not likely to be so small that it is in need of the protection that's afforded to individuals, and vulnerable individuals at that, and that they could have set their threshold a little lower. However, we also readily concede that the vast majority of corporate entities out there will not fall below the threshold and won't receive protection.
Perhaps the other thing worth adding is that the notion of protecting both individual consumers and corporate entities is a bit unwieldy. It's as Nick says, it's a laudable approach to protect small businesses. The problem is, I think, twofold. One is that the Act is inconsistent in terms of where it says you need to use the annual turnover as at the previous financial year to determine whether or not it meets the threshold, yet you calculate that threshold at the time of the transaction. And that might be two different issues. You might be below the threshold at the time of the transaction, but going back 11 months, you might be above the threshold. It's also conceivable that in the course of ongoing service or product supply, a juristic person could suddenly fall below or above the threshold during the course of that, and then you don't know what their protections are, what their obligations are, what your obligations are as a supplier. The other issue, of course, is that the Act makes provision for the use of audited financial statements in order to determine whether or not you've met the threshold. And of course, under the New Companies Act, majority of small businesses won't require an auditor and won't have audited financial statements. So I think to implement that is going to be quite a challenge as well.
A sector that will be heavily regulated is direct marketing. Will it be illegal for a consumer to be contacted via direct marketing unless that consumer has decided to opt in for such marketing? And what, if any, effect could this have?
The Act's point of departure is that it's an opt-out system. In other words, you may receive direct marketing only during certain times, unless you've specifically opted out. But read with the regulations, there's an element of opt-in, insofar as a direct marketer has to assume that every consumer that it looks to contact has opted out until it's in fact confirmed whether or not that consumer has. So there's a huge onus on direct marketers to find out with respect to every single consumer they wish to contact. And bear in mind that the direct marketing model is all about volumes, kind of widening the net as much as possible. So they will have thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, if not potentially millions of people on their database to contact. Now they are required under the Act to, in fact, specifically with regard to each and every person, find out whether that person has in fact opted out, and if so, to what extent, because of course you can opt out with respect to a particular telephone number, with regard to a particular email address. So you can say, I'm happy to be contacted on my Gmail address, but not my Hotmail address, and certainly not at work. So it's very complex in terms of what a direct marketer has to understand before he can make contact. Already, that makes it virtually impossible to run a direct marketing model. On top of that, you've got to rely on a registry, which is not yet in place, to keep track of all of that. So we're expecting a registry which will be able to keep track of every single consumer in the country, man, woman, and child, which in South African terms is an impossibility. And then furthermore, for them to be able to keep accurate records of who's opted out and to what extent. In my view, it's just too many places where something can go wrong. Human error will creep in somewhere, and if not human error, then people just will deliberately not adhere, making, I think, enforcement of this mechanism extremely difficult.
Which is unfortunate, because it has to be acknowledged that we've lagged behind the Western world, in particular on privacy laws. We don't have a comprehensive privacy law in place. One is coming. The draft of that law appears to be at odds with the draft regulations in some respects, in terms of opt-in, opt-out, and what you can and can't do. But it should be recognized that the rights of privacy that all individuals have under the consumers has been flouted to some extent in a marketing context by direct marketers who, through responsible organizations like the Direct Marketing Association, are coming round to the idea that consumers must have the right to say no. But there are these horror stories about consumers receiving unsolicited MMS messages on their cell phone, opening them up, being unable to delete them, and then having a voice message played to them every time they try to use their cell phone, and not knowing how to get rid of it, which is really a form of assault on the cell phone and damages the product. And then in one case, a consumer tells me that the only place that that particular cell phone number could have been obtained from was her bank, and it would appear that her bank has betrayed her by selling off her personal information to a marketer, and that's iniquitous, and this kind of practice that has to stop. And so it's just lamentable that, as far as we can see and where we sit now, with the regulation still being in draft form and us not knowing a week before the Act comes into effect what the regulations are actually going to look like. But sitting here as we do, looking at the regulations and saying it's not physically possible what they've got in mind. And if it is physically possible, and every marketer will check in with this registry for every consumer whenever they want to direct market, and this registry is then going to somehow manage to communicate to each consumer each time such a request is made, all that's going to happen is the consumer is going to have one set of unwelcome messages replaced with another, and there's a certain irony in that I don't think was an intended consequence of all of this.
Now, should a consumer opt out of direct marketing, including postal junk mail, and these items continue to be inserted into one's post box, to whom can the consumer complain, and who or what entity will classify a piece of communication as constituting junk mail?
What constitutes junk mail is anybody's guess, but I would suggest that it is unaddressed, possibly addressed, I suppose, physical paper message that is intended to convey an advertisement for a product or a service and to induce somebody to purchase that product or service. So I think it's a very wide concept, and there is much that will not escape that net, and it may even include the sort of flyers that are handed out at traffic intersections or road intersections very often. In terms of complaints, our understanding of the Act and the enforcement mechanisms are a little difficult to understand, is that most complaints are going to end up with the Consumer Commission. This is the ultimate watchdog body. And the Consumer Commission can then either itself deal with the complaint, or it can farm it out to an industry ombud if there's an accredited industry ombud, or an alternative dispute resolution organization that may be accredited in a particular area or field. They could deal with it. Possibly the registry operator itself may have a complaint receipt function to note complaints about these things, and they do have to note it because there is a provision in the draft regulations that says that the registry cannot deal with a direct marketer who is in contravention of the direct marketing provisions of the Act, so they'll be able to take complaints. What ultimately happens, though, is likely that whoever's going to deal with it is going to knock on the door of the perpetrator and say, you're in contravention, here's a compliance notice, sort yourself out. And it's only if that compliance notice is ignored or not complied with to its letter that the really serious consequences are likely to flow.
But I think this is another area where the whole proposed regime with regard to direct marketing begins to unravel, because you, as a supplier, in other words, as a person who is offering a product for sale and wants to make use of direct marketing, okay, you might very well say to your direct marketing agent, to say, look, make sure you check with the registry. Make sure you do not drop pamphlets or flyers into any post box which is on the registry as having opted out. Okay, and make sure that whoever you have delivering these things knows that. Okay, now let's assume that the direct marketer can do all of that and does do all of that. So he provides the person who you pay 100 Rand a day to walk up another neighborhood stuffing letterboxes with unsolicited mail. Okay, let's assume that they even get it right to say, in this neighborhood, these particular addresses you may not do. Now, they have to trust that unskilled worker to discern between one mailbox or the other, which is a massive increase in the workload. It used to be just, here's a pile of stuff, get rid of it. Now it's, hang on, we need to think about where we can and where we cannot. And of course, what happens is that the Act says that the supplier, who has had no personal involvement in that, will nevertheless be liable for the acts or omissions of its agents and its agents' employees, etc. So the liability will still attach to the supplier ultimately. So there's a massive risk for a supplier in undergoing direct marketing, if at the end of the day the complaint will land with the supplier directly, ultimately, even though he was trusting the direct marketing company to do everything properly and the direct marketing company's own staff to do everything properly. So you can see again how it's almost inevitable that something will go wrong. And in fairness, where does one then point the finger?
Consumers also have the right to cancel advance reservations and bookings and should expect cancellation fees to be reasonable. What constitutes a reasonable cancellation fee, and who decides on such reasonableness?
That's up to each supplier. That's left within the discretion of the supplier. There's some guidelines given. The supplier must first take note of what type of good or service it is that is being cancelled, the nature of it. In other words, is it the sort of thing that could expire? Can it be put on the shelf? Is it going to become obsolete? Because the next relevant consideration is the likelihood of being able to resell the good or service. That must be taken into account. They must look at the length of notice given, and obviously in particular circumstances, and they must pay attention to the general industry standard in that respect. We always caution clients not to discuss these matters with their competitors in an industry, because that immediately becomes a collusive issue. It's a price-related question. They must be very careful not to be lured into that trap. But it's a matter of reasonableness. And we always talk, for example, of an airline who has a seat booked on an extremely busy route where the planes are typically full and the consumer cancels 3 weeks in advance. The airline is going to resell their ticket. It should refund the consumer all or almost all of any amount that is paid up front. Similarly, if the consumer cancels his flight on the day and on a not very popular route, the airline would probably be within its rights to keep all or almost all of the amount paid up front. One should point out in respect to that provision, though, this applies to all goods and services other than special order goods. A special order good is one that is crafted or created specifically for me. So if I'm getting married and my wedding is cancelled at the last minute, I might be able to cancel the reservation with the function venue, but I can't cancel the wedding cake that I had specifically made for my wedding, because that was a special order good.
Another little, perhaps a tidbit to bear in mind is that regardless of what might or might not be reasonable in terms of a cancellation fee, if a consumer cannot enjoy the reservation because of his hospitalization or death, then no cancellation fee can be charged.
You mentioned that the regulations are a bit soft on so-called grey goods or parallel imports. Why do you say this?
The Act deals with two issues in one in regard to grey goods. It deals with grey goods or parallel imports, which are products which are legitimate products. They're not counterfeit goods, but they have found their way into the country through an unauthorized channel. So they've typically fallen off a container in the middle of the Indian Ocean, or they've come in through the Middle East somehow. They are legitimate products, but they are so-called grey. And what that means is they haven't got the support structure of an authorized distributor. So very often the warranty is affected. One can't vouch for the fact that it'll work in South Africa. DVD players and DVDs are an issue there, for instance. So there is a risk to the consumer. The other issue that is regulated at the same time is so-called reconditioned goods, which similarly are goods which retain the trademark or the brand name of the original equipment or good, but it's been reconditioned in some way. Okay. And both of those things carry risk to the consumers, because you think it's a legitimate, fully backed product, and it might not be. Okay, so what the Act says is that must be disclosed very clearly to the consumer. Okay, the regulations, however, only require disclosure of reconditioned goods, and have backed off very much in terms of having to disclose that a good is a grey good. And a previous iteration of the regulations were far stricter and said, in fact, wherever you offered parallel imports for sale, it had to be accompanied by a very clear sign saying this is not been imported with the express authorization of the manufacturer, and the factory warranty may not apply, for instance. And that was really going to go a long way towards, I think, curbing parallel imports, which are a big issue for multinational manufacturers who have considered their distribution channels quite carefully, and that was hopeful. And of course now the current or most recent regulations have backtracked from that and only require disclosure at point of sale with regard to reconditioned goods, quite strangely.
Now, the CPA will protect consumers. Are there any benefits at all for the supplier in this new law?
Very few. They've taken what they refer to as a rights-based approach. So the Act talks constantly of the consumer's right to this and the consumer's right to that. At no point does it ever talk about the right of the supplier, other than in very minor circumstances where it clarifies that the supplier has the right to charge a cancellation fee, for example, as we've discussed, but it must be reasonable, and so on. So it is very much about consumers' rights. There is no sympathy shown or given to suppliers. A great number of our clients who are suppliers are fretting, to say the least, about the costs of having to comply, worrying that they may have to pass those costs on, worrying that they may offer small variety of goods or products or competitions in one case as a result of this. And this is not a spiteful reaction to legislation that they now feel uncomfortable with. It's a natural commercial reaction to the realities of having to comply with regulation. But this isn't about suppliers' rights at all. It's about consumers' rights.
If there is a benefit for suppliers, it's probably indirect. And I think those suppliers who take an optimistic view of life will say that if there is a benefit for us, it's the fact that if we offer good quality products and services and treat our consumers properly, then those of our competitors who offer inferior products, who don't put consumer welfare and consumer satisfaction front of mind, are going to be in for the high jump, and they're going to be tied up in constant complaints. And that probably gives you a competitive edge and rewards you for offering goods and services that are of good quality. So I think there is an indirect benefit to suppliers insofar as it will perhaps clear the way in respect of sort of fly-by-night suppliers. And that might be something to look out for.
Donate now and give 15 Rand a month. SMS JOIN to 41486.